one of the topics that I personally discuss a lot in private with my friends and family is who's responsible for your child's academic success or your child's, educational success, if you like. And as you can imagine, this is a very heated debate and argument and discussion that I've always had for quite a long time. But I feel it's time for me to sort of bring this in this public domain. A lot of you obviously probably would have had similar discussion with your, friends and families. But I just thought, you know what, let's just bring it to the forum and bring it online and get people, publicly start discussing this, because I think it's a very important subject and we need to start opening our eyes going forwards. Now, I've seen many situations where, say for instance, parents' child or children who is failing in school or not doing very well, the first thing they do is blame the teachers and say, well, there's poor teachers, there's bad teachers, they're not teaching them properly, they're not taking as much interest or have any passion to teach the child or the students properly, so therefore the blame lies with them. I've also heard, some parents blame the government system and say, well, the system is bad, the government standard of education is poor, and they're not doing a very good job in terms of how they educate their children. Now, for me, I've always argued and debated that ultimately the responsibility is with the parents. It's not with the teachers and it's not with the government system. And, as you can imagine, a lot of people like up in arms, like, how can you say such a thing? We pay taxes, X, Y, and Z. We invest in the educational system. The government owes us a good education. And they're right to a certain degree. And I'll explain why ultimately, in my opinion, I feel the parents are ultimately responsible for the success of their child's education. Now, the key word to take note of here is your child's academic success or your child or children's educational success. So with that, bearing that in mind, teachers, I'm not going to throw them under the bus. They do a very, very good job and they're very vital, in terms of, children's development into adulthood in terms of their education. So I'm not going to be the one to throw them under the bus. Teachers, doctors, firemen, people like that, are very important in society. So I'll always have the utmost respect for them. But let's be honest now, in 2019, the educational system is not, in my opinion, as good as it used to be. And a lot of the teachers that's coming out, I'm not saying most of them, I'm saying a lot of them, that's coming out is just really ticking boxes based on the system that they're forced to work in. And what I mean is there's a set syllabus or curriculum that is set, and there's league tables, especially in the UK, that they've brought in. What these league tables mean is that we find it increasingly popular or common for teachers to just be spending time ticking boxes and, they have a set standard and a set regulations to adhere to. And once they teach a certain level and they cover certain topics within the syllabus, then they tick the box and the job is done. And many of these teachers, I must admit, are not as passionate or interested in the child's or the student's development. They're just there to, collect a paycheck, if you like. And likewise, if you look at the government system, they're also there to tick boxes too, because you go into the parliament, in a House of Parliament or House of Commons, whatever, and they just sit around and debate a set of standards and rules in terms of education. Once they pass those as laws and they become laws or rules or regulations, whatever you want to call them, then what happens is they then hand them down to the school bodies, and then the schools as institutions have to then tick these boxes. And then once those boxes are ticked, then the politicians can in turn tick their own boxes to say, we've set this level of education, and this level of education by a certain percentage, XYZ, is being met. So as long as it's being met, they feel they've done their job also. So they relieve themselves of any responsibility beyond the point of whatever standard that's initially being set in terms of their legal requirements. Now, I've always argued that, a student can go to a very bad school or poor performing school and being taught by poor performing teachers or teachers who just don't have the passion or care, and they could still be a good student. But that will only, in my opinion, happen if you have the parents that's been extremely active and spearheading their child's education going forwards. So the way I'm going to explain it is like this. If you look at the government from their standpoint, they set league tables, and these league tables is a bunch of, I would say, box ticking exercises. So, each year there's a certain amount of student that goes through high school or secondary school, as we say in the UK. And once those students are taught at a certain level and the teachers tick those boxes, that then in turn becomes the standard to determine how, that school sits on the league table, up or down or stationary. And that in turn attracts the type of students and the caliber of students that a particular university or high school or secondary school can attract for the next coming year. Now, the problem with this is, what tends to happen is academic institutions are now teaching students based on passing exams in order to be up on that league table. So there's a situation now where you're not really being taught comprehensively. You're just being taught, techniques, and you're covering syllabus that's most likely to come into the exam for your O levels and A levels or whatever, in order for you to be able to successfully sit the exam and pass it. So then you will contribute towards the success of that institution, which puts them higher up on the league table if more of you as a student body is passing the exams in question. So that to me is where the flaw is. And members of my family that I've debated with, I've asked them, I said, which do you prefer? A teacher that teaches you a subject for you to pass, or a teacher that teaches you a subject for you to understand it? And this particular family member said, well, obviously, teach me the subject. I want a teacher to teach me the subject in order for me to pass the exam, And I'm like, yeah, fair enough. I can see why you say that. But if you think about it, teaching you a subject in order for you to pass doesn't guarantee that you're going to pass. Basically, what the teachers are doing, because they want to be up on the league table, they're teaching techniques for you to pass because they know those particular type of questions are highly and likely to come in the exam. But there's no guarantee that those questions will come in the exam, and there's no guarantee that you'll pass. So the whole exercise is based around a technique to get you to pass the exam. The problem with that is, when you compare that to, say, a teacher who teaches a student to understand the subject, you guarantee you will pass. If you understand the subject, there is no way you can fail if you understand that subject. It's like anything else. How can you underperform in something that you understand completely? If you understand the subject matter, there's no way you can fail that exam. And that's the difference. The long-term effect of that is you can have professionals going out in the industry where they're basically taught and trained how to pass the necessary exams and get the necessary qualifications. They're now working in professional industries, especially some of these industries which are life dependent, if you like, or is safety dependent. And because they don't understand the area in which they're working in comprehensively, that's when they make mistakes, when the difficult periods come up and this is when their mettle is really being tested in terms of how well they know the subject matter or how well they know what they're doing. But because their knowledge is based on what's likely to come in the exam for them to pass, what happens is often than not, they basically are, underperforming, or they're not as reliable when it comes to the real test of time. But when it comes to the easy stuff or the more common stuff, they can deal with it. And that is the problem there and then. So what we need to start doing as parents is become more active in our child's education, because ultimately we are responsible for our child's success. We're the one that needs to be pushing our children. We need to be asking our children, have you got any exams? Have you got any homework? Have you got any projects? Have you got any tests coming up? Have you studied? Have you revised? Have you done any reading? What are you doing? Not just come home, play games for how many hours, but there's 2, 3, 4 homework that needs to be done, and at the last minute they're trying to knock them all out, and chances are they're not going to do any of them properly. And we need to, as parents, need to take that active role. And that's the point of this video. There's too many times, I think, in my opinion, parents are making the mistake of blaming teachers. And I'm not saying there aren't bad teachers. They're in the minority, but there are bad teachers out there. And the educational system is flawed. And we're not going to debate, whose fault, why it's flawed, whatever. It's flawed. Now, for parents, it's your children. You need to be the one to make sure that your child is learning. If you have to homeschool them, if you have to sit with them and do their homework with them and, set curriculum, set timetables for them. The whole world is run by timetables. I don't care what you're going to tell me. The world is run by timetables. If you take the time to look, you will see that the world is run by timetables, whether you like timetables or not. So in that respect, we as parents need to set timetables for our children to say, well, okay, there's a time when you can rest and play and do recreational stuff. And there's a time when you need to revise, practicing your handwriting. It's all good and well, you're doing well in school, but if your handwriting is terrible, then it's not legible. Therefore, teachers can't mark your work. And if teachers can't mark your work, you're likely to fail and get a 0 because they can't tell whether the answers you put down is right or wrong. But here's a more even important thing. I've always said to, in my family, I've said to the younger generation in my family that, listen, teachers are not there to teach you anymore. That's junior school and kindergarten school stuff. Once you reach the latter years in secondary or high school and going on university, they really don't teach you much. What they're doing is they're lecturing you. They recommend the books or the textbooks that you should study from and read from. They recommend the textbooks that they're likely to go through the class with, the curriculum, the syllabus. And they will read certain passages, they'll give you case studies, they'll give you examples and so on, and do some exercises on the board or in the class. But they're really not teaching you like they will do normally in the traditional sense. So really 80 to 90% of the work is on your own initiatives. In other words, you have to go out and read several books on a particular subject. So if you're not very good at math, sometimes the math book that the teacher recommends or the lecturer recommends might not be the textbook that is you can digest and understand it. You might have to go out and get another 2 or 3 textbooks. Yes, it's expensive, but if that's what it takes for you to understand and pass, then that's what it means for you. Because you need to be able to understand the subject and not just pass because the exam is based on what's coming in this book. But at the same time, that book doesn't cover a lot of the other elements within a particular subject that you really need to know if that's the area that you're going to be specializing in or going to be a profession, choose as your profession. So at the end of the day, it's really us, the parents, that need to be pushing our children and highlighting this to them and say, listen, don't just sit back and blame the teacher when you're failing. Don't just sit back and blame the school or the government institution when you're failing. You have to be there to invoke passion and inspire your child and, encourage them and support them, even if they're doing projects and homeworks that you find above your academic level, or is something that you've covered so many years ago when you were a student, you've forgotten how to do it. You can still go online, you can still do the research, and you can actually learn along with them, which is another good thing. So you're benefiting. But don't say, well, I'm not particularly good at that subject, or I didn't have a proper high school education or secondary school education, so therefore I don't feel like as if I'm going to be of any help to my children in helping them doing their homework. No, you have the internet. All the information is there for you. The biggest library in the world is the internet. You don't have to go and join a library and queue up and get a book and have to return it by a certain time and go through all that stuff. You can source all the information free at your fingertips. It's as simple as that. And you can get this information in seconds from hundreds of different sources. So you can collaborate your source and say, okay, I can compare this source with that source. And you can quickly weed out which ones are giving you false or, less than, up to standard information, as opposed to those who really are giving you the full 9 yards, so to speak. So I would say ultimately, the parents are the ones that should be really be pushing for their children's success. And dare I say, and I'll probably go into it in another video, that you can have a student that's going to a bad school being taught by poor teachers, and you can have a straight A student coming out of that school under that system, but the parents would have to be involved for that to be possible. And likewise, if you go to a private school, because I'll just say this quickly, I've seen a sort of a video between The Breakfast Club with what's his name, Killer Mike and DJ Envy. They had a very interesting and very passionate debate about private school as opposed to public schools, and both of them had really good points, and I agreed with both of what they were saying. But the one thing I would add to that discussion is going to a private school, and I have many friends who have gone to private school. Going to a private school doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're being taught to the best of that particular student's ability. That's a separate point that a lot of people skip over. It doesn't automatically mean the education you get there is the best education that you can possibly get. But it does set you up for, in life better in terms of the future. It does, and we can see the obvious connections between, that. But that's for another video, and that's for another time. So I just want to end this by saying, don't rely on teachers and the government system or the schools for your child's ultimate educational success, and don't feel that you should just basically take a backseat and let the system do everything, and then when they fail you blame them. You have to blame yourself, because you're not there, you're not actively involved in your child's education. And if you're not actively involved in your child's education, then the big question is, why should they? They're just ticking boxes and making sure they're following certain rules and regulations and teaching at a certain standard and covering certain topics. And once they've done that and they tick those boxes, their job is done. They get their money. And if your child still fail, then that's not really their fault. The fault really at that point is, the parents are not involved. They're absent. So that's something to bear in mind going forwards. And with that said, I leave you to, say however you think about it and have this debate amongst your friends and your family.